The Confession of Angels. The vox crackled once, then died. In that silence, Captain Ezekiel of the Deathwing felt the weight of 10,000 years press against his chest, like a fallen cathedral. The transmission had come from the rock itself, from the Watcher's inner sanctum, where even Terminators feared to tread without summons. 3 words, spoken in the lion's own voice, impossible and undeniable. The secret breaks. He had spent 2 centuries hunting the fallen across stars that barely remembered Terra's name. He had pulled triggers on brothers whose only crime was being born on the wrong side of history. He had lied to chapter masters, deceived inquisitors, and watched good men die confused and betrayed because the truth was a poison that could not be allowed to spread. Now, standing in the observation dome of the strike cruiser Intractable, watching the warp storms gather like funeral shrouds around distant Fenris, Ezekiel understood that all those sacrifices had been a prayer to a god who was no longer listening. Somewhere in the galaxy, someone had spoken. Someone had broken the seal. The Dark Angel's greatest shame was about to become the Imperium's greatest crisis, and there would be no forgiveness, no understanding, no mercy. Only fire and the terrible mathematics of betrayal. The story begins not with revelation, but with erosion, the slow grinding away of certainty that precedes every apocalypse. For 10 millennia, the First Legion had maintained an architecture of silence so complete that even their own battle brothers fought and died without understanding the shadow that moved behind their chapters' eyes. Interrogator chaplains worked in cells carved from the rock's dead stone, where screams were swallowed by ancient darkness, and confessions were catalogued in books bound with human skin. The inner circle met in chambers that had no doors, only walls that opened when the proper litanies were sung, in voices that remembered Caliban's forests. They had built a prison out of tradition, locked it with oaths, and thrown away the key into the warp itself. But prisons, like all human things, eventually fail. The question was never if, but when, and what would crawl out when the walls finally crumbled. The first crack appeared on Piscina 4, a world so loyal to the Imperium that its children were named after saints, and its factories produced lasguns even during famine. The Dark Angels had come to prosecute a war against an Orc-Wag, a simple operation that should have been inscribed in history as another victory for the Emperor's finest. But in the ruins of a burned-out manufactorum, a scout sergeant found something that should not have existed. A data slate, pre-heresy manufacture, sealed with the lion and sword of the old Legion. The words inscribed on its surface were in High Gothic, so ancient that only the librarius could parse them, and what they said turned the sergeant's blood to ice water. Caliban endures. The lion lied. We are the loyal. They are the fallen. The sergeant did what he had been trained to do since his first day in the 10th Company. He delivered the slate to his superiors and asked no questions. 12 hours later, every scout in his squad was dead, killed in an ambush that the official reports attributed to Orc snipers. The sergeant himself vanished into the rock's lowest levels, and when he emerged 3 months later, his eyes were hollow and his hands shook when he held a bolter. He never spoke of what he had seen in those lightless chambers, but his battle brothers noticed that he no longer sang the old Legion hymns, and when the chaplains called for prayers, his lips moved without sound, as if the words had been cut from his tongue with something sharper than knives. This was the machinery of containment, perfected over centuries. Suppress, eliminate, bury, repeat, until the lie becomes indistinguishable from truth. But the data slate had not been alone. Across a dozen sectors, similar artifacts began surfacing like corpses rising from a mass grave. On Thramus, a librarian detected a psychic echo emanating from a derelict station, a memory fragment that showed dark angels firing on dark angels while a world burned behind them. On Diamot, an inquisitor of the Ordo Hereticus unearthed a journal written by a remembrancer who claimed to have witnessed Luther's final stand, and her account contradicted everything the official Imperium histories taught about Caliban's end. Even on Terra itself, in the archives beneath the Senatorum Imperialis, a scribe discovered a notation in a ledger from the early days of the Great Crusade. First Legion, notable for secrecy, Command structure unclear. Primarch often absent. Recommend observation. The notation was unsigned, but the handwriting matched records from Malcador the Sigillite himself. Someone, somewhere, was orchestrating a revelation. Whether through plan or accident, the mechanisms that had kept the Dark Angel's shame contained were failing simultaneously across the galaxy, and the chapter's response was as swift as it was brutal. Strike teams were dispatched to every world where evidence had appeared. Entire populations were declared in violation of obscure administratum codes and subjected to punitive action. Libraries burned. Witnesses disappeared. On Thramas, the librarian who had detected the psychic echo was found dead in his sanctum, his brain liquefied by what the apothecaries called a catastrophic stroke, though no stroke left symbols carved into the victim's skull from the inside. The Dark Angels moved with the efficiency of a machine built for a single purpose, but machines can be broken, and this one was shattering against a problem it had not been designed to solve. The truth was not a single artifact that could be destroyed, or a single witness that could be silenced. It was a pattern, vast and undeniable, written into the fabric of Imperial history itself. And patterns, once perceived, cannot be unseen. The turning point came on a world whose name is no longer spoken in any but the most secret councils of the Adeptus Terra. It was a cardinal world, home to a shrine where pilgrims came to venerate a relic said to contain a fragment of the Emperor's own benediction. The planetary governor was a pious man who had served the Imperium for 40 years without complaint, and when the Dark Angels arrived demanding access to the cathedral archives, he welcomed them as brothers in the Emperor's light. What he did not know was that those archives contained records from the Horus heresy itself, first-hand accounts from warriors who had fought at Caliban's destruction and survived to write their testimonies before age or battle claimed them. The Dark Angels had come to ensure those records never reached the wider Imperium. The governor, in his innocence, showed them to the vaults personally, proud to host such august warriors. By dawn, the cathedral was ash. The governor and his entire household were dead, and the orbital batteries of the planet were firing on the Dark Angel ships as they withdrew. The massacre had been witnessed by too many. The pilgrims, the priests, the Adepta Sororitas who guarded the shrine, they had all seen the Dark Angels cut down unarmed civilians to protect a secret, and they had transmitted their testimony across the Vox before the chapter could silence them. Within a week, 3 other chapters of the Adeptus Astartes had demanded explanations. Within a month, the Inquisition had opened formal inquiries. The secret that the Dark Angels had killed to protect was now being discussed in council chambers across 100 sectors, and the question everyone was asking was simple and terrible. What could be worth such slaughter? The answer, when it finally came, arrived not through investigation, but through invasion. A warband of Chaos Space Marines, bearing colors and heraldry that had not been seen since the heresy, struck at an inquisitorial fortress on the edge of the Segmentum Obscurus. They fought with the discipline of Legion veterans and the fury of the damned, and when they withdrew, they left behind a single captive, chained and hooded, delivered like a gift to the Inquisitor's doorstep. Beneath the hood was a face that should not have existed, a space marine in armor that predated the Codex Astartes, his plate black and gold, and marked with the winged sword of the old First Legion. He called himself Mephirin, and he claimed to be a survivor of Caliban's fall, one of the fallen who had been fighting in the Emperor's name for 10,000 years, while his own brothers hunted him like an animal. The Inquisitor, a woman named Covenant who had earned her rosette through 3 decades of hunting heretics, recognized the implications immediately. If this warrior spoke truth, then the Dark Angels had been hiding not just a shameful secret, but a crime that touched the foundations of the Imperium itself. She ordered him brought to Terra, under guards so heavy that entire companies of Astra Militarum were mobilized to escort the prison ship. The Dark Angels, predictably, tried to stop her. The battle that followed lit up the void like a second sun. 3 strike cruisers dropped from the warp directly into the convoy's path, weapons already charging, their Vox channels broadcasting demands for the prisoners' immediate surrender. Covenant refused. Her flagship, The ancient battlecruiser Unyielding Truth had been present at the siege of Terra itself, and its captain was not impressed by threats from Astartes, no matter how glorious their lineage. The engagement lasted 4 hours and cost both sides dearly. 2 of the Dark Angel's cruisers were crippled, their hulls split open by lance strikes that boiled atmosphere into vacuum. The Unyielding Truth lost its entire starboard gun deck and 3,000 crew, but it held its course, and when the surviving Dark Angel ship broke off, Covenant had proven something important. The First Legion was not invincible, and more critically, they were willing to fire on other Imperial forces to keep their secrets buried. That willingness would be their undoing. By the time the convoy reached Terra's orbit, every major faction in the Imperium had heard of the battle, and the questions were no longer whispered in private, but shouted in the Senatorum itself. What were the Dark Angels hiding? Who were the fallen? And why, in the Emperor's name, was a loyal chapter acting like traitors to keep that knowledge suppressed? Mephirin was brought before a tribunal, consisting of representatives from the High Lords themselves, the Inquisition, the Adeptus Custodes, and 3 chapter masters from chapters with no ties to the First Legion's successor lineage. The chamber where they gathered was older than the Imperium, a place where truth was supposed to be sacred and lies burned away in the Emperor's light. Mephirin, still in chains, stood before them without fear, and when they asked him to speak, he told them a story that inverted everything they thought they knew about the Horus heresy. Caliban, he said, had not rebelled against the Emperor. Luther had not turned traitor out of jealousy or ambition. The truth was darker and infinitely more complicated, a tale of misunderstanding and tragedy that had been buried under 10,000 years of desperate lies. When the Lion had returned to Caliban near the end of the heresy, he had found his home world in turmoil, but not in the way the official histories claimed. Luther had not fallen to chaos. He had discovered something about the Lion, about the Emperor's plans for the legions after the war, something so terrible that he could not remain silent. A confrontation had occurred, but it was the Lion who struck first, driven by paranoia and the weight of secrets he could not share, even with his oldest friend. The planet had burned not because Luther was a traitor, but because the Lion could not afford to let the truth survive. The tribunal listened in silence that felt like death itself. When Mephirin finished, the custodian representative, a warrior who had stood vigil over the Golden Throne for 3,000 years, asked a single question. What secret could justify such destruction? Mephirin's answer was simple and catastrophic. The Emperor intended to destroy all the legions once the crusade was complete. We were weapons, built for conquest, too dangerous to be allowed to endure once the war was won. The Lion knew, he had always known, and Luther discovered it. The words hung in the air like poison. Around the chamber, eyes met eyes, and in those exchanges, calculations were made. If Mephirin spoke truth, then the Dark Angels had spent 10 millennia hunting and killing their own brothers to cover up not a betrayal, but a failed mercy-killing, an attempt to prevent the revelation of a secret that could tear the Imperium apart even now. Worse, it meant that every lie the Dark Angels had told, every ally they had deceived, every innocent they had murdered, had been in service to protecting not the Emperor's work, but the Lion's guilt. The custodian stood, his auramite plate catching the chamber's dim light like frozen lightning. If this account is true, he said, his voice carrying the weight of Terra's highest authority, then the First Legion has committed treason not once, but continuously for 10,000 years. The consequences cannot be delayed or negotiated. The tribunal's judgment was delivered within the hour, but its execution would take far longer and cost far more than anyone could have imagined. The Dark Angels were to be declared excommunicate traitorous, their chapter dissolved, their gene seed examined and potentially destroyed, and every warrior bearing their colors was to be hunted down and forced to answer for their crimes. It was a death sentence for one of the oldest and most honored chapters in the Imperium, and the Dark Angels' response was exactly what anyone who knew them should have expected. They refused. The Rock, that massive fortress monastery that was all that remained of Caliban itself, activated drives that should not have functioned after 10,000 years of neglect, and translated directly into the warp, vanishing from all sensors and communication. Across the galaxy, every Dark Angel's successor chapter received the same coded transmission. The secret is revealed. The hunt ends. Loyalty is its own reward. Within days, entire companies of Unforgiven vanished from their posts, abandoning campaigns and breaking oaths to rejoin their parent chapter for what could only be one purpose. The Dark Angels were preparing for war, not against the enemies of the Imperium, but against the Imperium itself. The Imperium's response was hampered by centuries of bureaucracy and the sheer logistical impossibility of organizing a coherent response across a galaxy already burning with 1,000 wars. The High Lords issued edicts. The Inquisition mobilized kill teams. Loyal chapters were called upon to hunt their former brothers, but many refused, citing the bonds of the Adeptus Astartes and the questionable nature of Mephirin's testimony. Was he truly a loyal warrior wronged by history, or was this some elaborate chaos plot designed to turn the Imperium's finest against each other? The doubt was a weapon as sharp as any blade, and the Dark Angels used it ruthlessly. Their agents spread counter-narratives through every channel they could access. Mephirin was a demon in disguise. The tribunal had been infiltrated by traitors. The real conspiracy was not the Dark Angel's secret, but an attempt by the Inquisition to destroy the chapters one by one, beginning with the First Legion because they were too powerful to be controlled. Some of these lies took root. On a dozen worlds, Imperial governors refused to cooperate with Inquisitors hunting the Unforgiven, claiming they were protecting loyal servants of the Emperor from a witch hunt. On others, entire regiments of the Astra Militarum mutinied when ordered to fire on Dark Angels they had fought beside for decades. The Imperium, already fractured by the Great Rift and centuries of catastrophe, began to crack along new fault lines, and at the center of every fracture was the question, who do you trust when the angels themselves are falling? The first major engagement of what would come to be called the War of Black Secrets occurred in the Tantalus sector, where a Dark Angel's fleet intercepted an inquisitorial armada en route to the rock's last known coordinates. The battle was not a skirmish or a raid, but a full-scale naval engagement involving dozens of capital ships and thousands of support craft. The Dark Angels fought with the precision of veterans who had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of war, but the Inquisition had brought allies, including elements of the Imperial Navy, the Adeptus Sororitas, and 2 full companies of Minotaur Space Marines, a chapter known for its willingness to make war on other Astartes when the High Lords commanded it. The void burned for 3 days. Torpedoes carved through the dark like falling stars. Lance batteries turned ships into expanding clouds of superheated gas. Boarding actions raged through corridors slick with blood and zero-gravity fire, and when the guns finally fell silent, both sides had paid a terrible price. The inquisitorial fleet was crippled, forced to retreat to the nearest Imperial stronghold for repairs that would take years. But the Dark Angels had lost 2, including the venerable strike cruiser Sword of Caliban, which died with all hands when its plasma reactor was breached by a Minotaur's boarding team that fought to the last man. The wreckage drifted in the void, broadcasting an automated distress signal that no one would answer, because there were no reinforcements coming for either side. The Imperium's resources were stretched so thin that even this catastrophic battle was just one more entry in a ledger already drowning in blood. Back on Terra, in the chambers beneath the Senatorum, where the High Lords made decisions that shaped the fate of humanity, arguments raged with an intensity not seen since the age of apostasy. Some demanded total war, the mobilization of every resource necessary to destroy the Dark Angels and their successors before they could do more damage. Others counseled caution, pointing out that the Unforgiven collectively represented thousands of Space Marines, veteran warriors, whose loss would be catastrophic at a time when the Imperium needed every bolter it could field. A third faction, smaller but growing, suggested a darker possibility. What if Mephirin had told the truth? What if the Emperor truly had planned to cull the legions after the Crusade? If that secret became common knowledge, it would not only vindicate the Dark Angels, It would call into question the loyalty of every Space Marine chapter in existence. The Astartes would wonder if they too were tools to be discarded when their usefulness ended, and that doubt could fracture the Imperium's military might beyond repair. The High Lords, faced with a choice between 3 different apocalypses, chose the one that seemed most survivable. They declared the Dark Angels excommunicate, but offered a path to redemption, surrender, confession, and penance. The rock would be open to inspection by the Inquisition and the Custodes. Every member of the inner circle would submit to psychic interrogation. The fallen would be judged individually, not as a collective, and those found innocent of true heresy would be granted the Emperor's mercy. It was a compromise designed to give the Dark Angels an alternative to mutual annihilation, and it might have worked if the chapter had been capable of trust. They were not. The Dark Angels' reply to the High Lord's offer was delivered by Azrael, Supreme Grand Master of the chapter, in a Vox transmission that was simultaneously broadcast to every Imperial world with functioning communications. His voice was calm, almost sad, as he spoke words that had been written in the hearts of his brothers for 10,000 years. We are the first. We were the Emperor's chosen when the stars were young and Terra's enemies were uncounted. We have fought in his name across every battlefield that matters, and we have paid for our loyalty in blood and shame. We bear a secret that we did not create, a wound that we did not inflict, and we have spent 10 millennia trying to heal it in the only way we knew how. You call us traitors. You demand our surrender. You threaten us with destruction. But we are the Dark Angels, and we do not kneel to those who have forgotten what loyalty truly costs. If you want our confession, come and take it. We will be waiting. The transmission ended. Across the Imperium, those who heard it understood that diplomacy had failed. The Dark Angels would fight, and the war that was coming would make the Horus heresy look like a border skirmish. But before the war could truly begin, something changed. The Rock, that impossible fortress that had been silent since its flight from Imperial space, reappeared in orbit above a world called Meridia, a planet that had no strategic value and no connection to the Dark Angel's history. The chapter's fleet surrounded it like a crown of thorns, weapons charged but not firing, and from the rock itself a signal was broadcast on frequencies so ancient that only the oldest cogitators could even decode them. The message was simple. The lion sleeps no more. Judgment comes. For those who understood the significance, the words were more terrifying than any threat. The lion, the Primarch of the First Legion, had been mortally wounded during Caliban's destruction and placed in stasis deep within the rock. His survival, a secret known only to the highest ranks of the chapter. If he had awakened, if he now stood among his sons once more, then the calculus of the entire conflict had changed. A Primarch was not merely a space marine, not even merely a gene-crafted Superman. He was a fragment of the Emperor's own will given form, a being whose presence on a battlefield could turn the tide of entire wars. And if the Lion chose to lead his sons in open rebellion against the Imperium, there was no force in the galaxy short of another Primarch or the Custodes at full strength that could stand against him. The Imperium's response was immediate and desperate. Every available chapter of Astartes was called upon to converge on Meridia. The Imperial Navy began mobilizing battle groups that had not seen action together since the Gothic War. Even the Adeptus Custodes, those 10,000 immortal guardians who rarely left Terra except in the direst need, dispatched a full shield company to lead the assault. The orders were clear. The rock must be boarded, the Dark Angels must be subdued, and if the Lion truly had awakened, he must be brought to Terra to answer for his legion's crimes. It was a task that would have been impossible under normal circumstances, but these were not normal circumstances. The Lion was no fool. If he had revealed himself now, it was because he believed he could win, and that belief alone was enough to make even the bravest warriors hesitate. The fleets began to gather, a armada larger than any assembled since the siege of Terra, and at its head was the Custodian Shield Captain, a warrior named Valerian who had fought in the Webway War and seen horrors that would break lesser men. He stood on the bridge of his ship, staring at the rock through viewports that could magnify a single crater to fill his entire vision, and he wondered if he was about to commit the Imperium to a war it could not win. The assault on Meridia began at dawn, though dawn on that world was a relative thing, its sun a red dwarf that cast everything in hues of rust and old. Blood. The Imperial fleet translated from the warp in a coordinated drop that should have caught the Dark Angels by surprise, but the First Legion had been preparing for this battle since the moment they fled Terra, and they were ready. The void around Meridia erupted into fire as defense platforms, hidden among the planet's asteroid belt, opened up with lance batteries and macro cannons that could punch through battleship armor. Torpedoes screamed across the dark on pillars of flame. Fighters and bombers swarmed from both sides, filling the space between capital ships with a storm of explosions and dying men. The Dark Angels fought with a desperation born of 10,000 years of repression, every warrior knowing that this was the final battle, the moment when their chapter would either be vindicated or erased from history. The Imperial forces fought with the cold fury of betrayal, seeing in every Dark Angel the face of a traitor who had lied to them for millennia. The battle was not war, it was butchery, and it raged across 3 dimensions of space, with an intensity that turned night into perpetual day. On the rock itself, Azrael stood in the Hall of the First, surrounded by the relics of his chapter's long history, and he prayed. Not to the Emperor, though he spoke the proper words, but to the Lion, the father he had never known except through legend and the cold silence of a stasis tomb. He prayed for strength, for wisdom, for some sign that the path they had chosen was right, that the sacrifices had meant something, that the secret they had killed to protect was worth the cost. Behind him, the doors to the hall opened, and a figure entered, towering and terrible, clad in armor that had not been forged by mortal hands. The Lion had come, and he wasn't the savior Azrael had prayed for. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow with a grief that spanned millennia, and when he spoke, his voice was the sound of a world dying. "I have seen what you have done in my name," the Primarch said. "I have walked the halls of this fortress and read the records you thought were secret. I have seen the bodies, heard the confessions, counted the lies. You have become what Luther feared we would become, and I do not know if I can forgive you for that." Azrael fell to his knees, not in supplication but in despair, because he understood in that moment that they had lost. Not the battle, not the war, but something far more fundamental. They had lost the right to call themselves angels. The Lion walked past him, through corridors lined with the armor of the fallen, each suit a memorial to a brother who had died twice, once on Caliban and again in the lightless cells of the rock. He reached the deepest chamber, where the survivors of the original rebellion were still held, ancient warriors kept alive through technologies that bordered on heresy, and he released them. Not because they were innocent, but because they deserved to face judgment from someone who had been there, who understood the choices they had made and the reasons behind them. Luther was among them, the arch-traitor himself, aged beyond recognition but still alive, still defiant. He looked at the Lion with eyes that held no fear, only sadness, and he spoke words that cut deeper than any blade. "I tried to save them," Luther said, his voice a whisper that carried the weight of 10,000 years. "I tried to save the Legion from you, from the Emperor's plans, from the future I saw coming, and you burned our world to keep that future secret. Was it worth it, my lord? Was it worth 10 millennia of hunting our own brothers, of living a lie so vast that it ate our souls? Was it worth becoming the monsters we swore to destroy?" The Lion had no answer. He simply stood there, silent as a statue, and let the question hang in the air like a noose. Outside, the battle raged on, but it was already over. The Lion's appearance had broken something fundamental in the Dark Angel's will to fight, and one by one, ships began to stand down, their captains transmitting surrender codes that had not been used since the heresy. The Imperial fleet, sensing victory, pressed their advantage, but Valerian, the custodian shield captain, ordered them to hold fire. He had seen enough war to recognize when an enemy was defeated not by force, but by truth, and he wanted to understand what had happened on the rock before he passed judgment. His ship, a sleek golden blade called the Emperor's Patience, approached the fortress monastery under a flag of truce, and when he stepped onto its ancient decks, he was met not by warriors prepared for battle, but by sons waiting for execution. They knelt in rows, thousands of them, from newly inducted scouts to veterans who had fought since the age of apostasy, and at their head was the lion himself, unarmed and unarmored, his face a mask of grief so profound that even Valerian, who had seen the emperor's own pain etched into the walls of the imperial palace, felt something in his ancient heart crack. The trial that followed was not held in a grand chamber or broadcast across the Imperium. It occurred in the Hall of the First, with only a handful of witnesses, Valerian and his custodes, Azrael and the surviving members of the Inner Circle, Mephirin and the Fallen who had lived to see this day, and the Lion who sat in judgment not as a defendant, but as a witness to his own legion's damnation. The testimony lasted 3 days and nights, and when it was finished, everyone present understood that there were no heroes in the story, only victims of a war that had never truly ended. The Lion spoke of the Emperor's plans, not as rumor or speculation, but as fact, because he had been there when they were made. The Primarchs, he explained, were always meant to be temporary, weapons to be retired when the crusade was complete, because the Emperor understood that beings of their power could never coexist with the Imperium he envisioned. Some Primarchs had known this, others had suspected. Luther had discovered it through old documents and forbidden archives, and his rebellion had been a desperate attempt to give the Legion a choice, to let them decide their own fate, rather than be quietly disbanded, or worse. The Lion, loyal to his core and terrified of the implications, had chosen to destroy that choice before it could spread, and Caliban had burned because he could not imagine a future where the First Legion disobeyed the Emperor's will. Luther, given the chance to speak, confirmed the Lion's account, but he added layers that even the Primarch had not known. The Emperor, he said, had not planned to simply disband the legions. He had intended to integrate them into a new order, one where Space Marines would be guardians rather than conquerors, protectors of humanity rather than its executioners. But the integration would require changes, modifications to the gene seed and the conditioning, and some Primarchs would not survive the process. Luther's rebellion had been an attempt to preserve the Legion as it was, to give the warriors he loved a chance to remain themselves rather than be transformed into something new and unknown. The Lion had seen this as treason, because he could not conceive of a world where loyalty meant anything other than absolute obedience. And the tragedy of Caliban was that both brothers had been right and both had been wrong, and the only ones who had truly lost were the warriors caught between them. Mephirin, listening to this, wept for the first time in 10,000 years, because he understood that he and his fallen brothers had spent millennia being hunted for a choice they had never made, labeled traitors for refusing to accept a transformation they had never been offered. Valerian, when all testimony was complete, stood and delivered a judgment that would echo through imperial history for generations. The Dark Angels, he declared, were guilty of crimes against the Imperium, crimes of deception and murder and betrayal that could not be forgiven or forgotten. But they were also victims of a secret that should never have been kept, a burden placed on them by forces beyond their control, and their punishment would reflect that complexity. The chapter would be dissolved, its colors struck from the records, its fortress monastery decommissioned. But the warriors themselves would be given a choice. Those who wished could take new oaths, join other chapters or imperial organizations, and continue to serve the emperor under different names and different banners. Those who could not live with that compromise would be allowed to take their own lives, a final mercy for warriors who had lived in shadow for so long that light was unbearable. And the Lion, the Primarch who had started all of this with a single catastrophic decision, would return to Terra to stand before the Emperor's throne and explain himself, not to the High Lords or the Inquisition, but to whatever fragment of his father's will still burned within the Golden Throne's chambers. It was not justice, because justice was impossible when everyone involved was both criminal and victim. It was simply the best that could be done. The dissolution of the Dark Angels took months, a slow unraveling of a brotherhood that had endured for 10,000 years. Some warriors accepted the offer of new service, taking oaths to chapters, like the Blood Angels or the Space Wolves, chapters known for accepting broken warriors and reforging them. Others chose the final mercy, standing in execution chambers and receiving the Emperor's peace from chaplains who wept as they pulled the triggers. Azrael was among those who chose to live, though he laid down his titles and his honors and requested assignment as a simple battle brother in a chapter far from Terra. His request was granted, and he spent his remaining years fighting on the edges of the Imperium, in wars no one remembered and on worlds no one cared about. And when he finally died, it was with a bolter in his hands and the Emperor's name on his lips, and no one who stood over his body knew that he had once been Supreme Grand Master of the First Legion. The Lion returned to Terra as promised, walking the halls of the Imperial Palace for the first time in 10 millennia, and when he reached the throne room, he knelt before his father's withered form and spoke words that only the Emperor could hear. What passed between them remains unknown, but when the Lion emerged, he wore chains of gold, and he announced that he would remain on Terra, serving as a living reminder of the costs of secrecy and the price of loyalty taken to its darkest extremes. The fallen, those ancient warriors who had been hunted for so long, were given the choice to remain with the Imperium or to depart into the unknown reaches of space. Most chose to stay, taking new names and new lives, though they carried with them the memory of what had been done to them, and the knowledge that justice, even when finally achieved, could never heal all wounds. Mephirin, who had started the revelation with his capture and his testimony, became a wanderer, traveling from world to world and telling the story of Caliban to anyone who would listen, not as propaganda or condemnation, but as a warning about the dangers of secrets kept too long and truths buried too deep. Some called him a hero, others called him a traitor. He accepted both labels with equal grace because he understood that history is written by the survivors, and the survivors are rarely pure. The War of Black Secrets ended not with a bang, but with exhaustion, the Imperium too battered to pursue further vengeance, and the Dark Angels too broken to offer further resistance. But the war's consequences rippled outward, touching every corner of the galaxy. Other chapters began to question their own secrets, wondering what truths they had hidden and whether those truths would one day destroy them as thoroughly as the Dark Angels had been destroyed. The Inquisition, which had always operated in shadow, found itself subject to new scrutiny, with demands for transparency and accountability that it could not easily dismiss. Even the High Lords, those distant masters of humanity's fate, began to understand that the Imperium they ruled was built on foundations of lies and compromises, and that those foundations were beginning to crack. Change came slowly, as it always does in institutions as vast and ossified as the Imperium. But it came, and historians would later mark the War of Black Secrets as the beginning of what some called the Age of Revelation, when old truths were finally spoken aloud, and the cost of keeping them hidden was laid bare for all to see. On a world far from Terra, in a small chapel built by refugees from a war no one else remembered, a priest stood before a congregation of the desperate and the faithful and told them a story. It was the story of Caliban, of two brothers who loved each other and destroyed each other, of a legion that spent 10,000 years trying to outrun its own shame. He told them that the Dark Angels were gone, scattered to the winds or fallen into dust, and that the secret they had killed to protect was now known by everyone. And he asked his congregation what they had learned from this. One voice, a child too young to understand the full weight of the question, said simply, "That secrets hurt more than truth." The priest smiled, though his eyes were sad, and he told the child that she was wise beyond her years, and that if the Imperium could learn that lesson, perhaps the Dark Angel's suffering would not have been entirely in vain. But the Imperium is not good at learning lessons. It is an empire built on forgetting, on burying the past beneath layers of dogma and propaganda, until the truth becomes indistinguishable from myth. Already, as the years passed and the War of Black Secrets faded into history, scholars were rewriting the narrative, softening the edges, turning complex tragedy into simple morality tales. The Dark Angels became cautionary figures, warnings against the sin of pride, and their real crime, the desperate attempt to protect a secret that could destroy them, was transformed into something more palatable and less challenging to the Imperium's self-image. The fallen were forgotten again, not through malice, but through indifference, and the truths that Mephirin and his brothers had died to reveal became footnotes in histories that few would read and fewer still would believe. This, too, is the nature of empire, to consume its own history and excrete only the parts that serve the present, and the Dark Angels, in their final act, proved that even revelation is temporary when the mechanisms of forgetting are so well established. Yet some remember. In the dark corners of the Imperium, in the places where power does not reach, and truth is still valued more than conformity, the story of the Dark Angels is told in full, with all its complexity and pain. Former members of the Legion, living under new names and bearing new colors, tell it to their brothers when the watches are quiet and the enemies are distant. Inquisitors, those who value truth over dogma, include it in their reports, knowing that their words will likely be redacted, but hoping that someone, somewhere, will read between the lines. And the Lion, chained to Terra and standing eternal vigil over sins that cannot be undone, tells it to himself in the endless hours of his penance, remembering not just what he did, but why he did it, and wondering if his father, locked in his own prison of pain and duty, understands the choice he made and the price he paid for it. These memories are fragile things, easily erased by the grinding machinery of imperial bureaucracy, but they endure because memory, like truth, is more resilient than the powers that seek to suppress it would like to believe. In the end, the question that haunted the Dark Angels from the beginning remains unanswered. Was loyalty worth the cost? For 10,000 years, they believed it was, that protecting the secret and maintaining their honor justified any sacrifice, any atrocity, any betrayal of the principles they claimed to serve. But when the secret was finally revealed, and the consequences finally came due, what remained? A chapter destroyed, a brotherhood shattered, and a legacy so tainted that even speaking the name Dark Angels became an act of remembrance for tragedy rather than glory. Perhaps that was the real revelation, not the secret itself, but the understanding that loyalty, taken to its extreme, becomes indistinguishable from madness, and that the only way to truly serve the Emperor is to serve the truth, no matter how terrible that truth might be. The Dark Angels learned that lesson too late to save themselves, but perhaps, in their destruction, they saved others from making the same mistake. Perhaps their suffering purchased a moment of clarity in an Imperium that desperately needs it. Or perhaps, as many believe, they simply proved that the Imperium is too vast and too broken to be saved by any revelation, and that the only response to tragedy is to bury it deep enough that no one will ever dig it up again. The rock still exists, though it is no longer the fortress monastery of the Dark Angels. It has been claimed by the Inquisition, transformed into a research facility where scholars study the artifacts and records left behind, trying to understand how a chapter could fall so far while still believing they were righteous. Among those artifacts is the journal of interrogator chaplain Asmodai, who spent 3 centuries extracting confessions from the fallen and who, in his final entry, wrote words that still echo through the empty halls. I have broken 1,000 brothers to save 10,000 more, and I do not know if the Emperor will forgive me for that mathematics. But I know that I did. What I believed was necessary, and if I am damned for it, I will carry that damnation with pride, because it means the chapter survives. The journal was sealed after his death and hidden in the deepest vaults, but scholars who have read it say that its final pages are stained with tears, and that Asmodai's handwriting, normally so precise, became increasingly erratic as he approached his end, as if the weight of his certainty was finally beginning to crack. Whether those scholars speak truth or simply project their own guilt onto a convenient martyr is unknown, but the story persists because it is a useful story, and the Imperium has always valued utility over truth. And so the Imperium continues, vast and terrible and indifferent to the suffering of any single chapter, no matter how glorious their history or how deep their shame. New wars are fought, new heroes rise, new secrets are buried, and new lies are told to protect them, because the machinery of empire cannot function without secrets, and loyalty without lies is a concept the Imperium has never been able to comprehend. The Dark Angels are gone, but their legacy remains, a warning carved in blood and betrayal, that the cost of keeping secrets is always higher than the price of revealing them, and that those who choose loyalty over truth will eventually find that they have become the very thing they swore to destroy. Whether anyone heeds that warning is another question entirely, and the answer, as always in the grim darkness of the far future, is written in the countless wars that rage across a galaxy too broken to ever truly heal. The lion stands on Terra, looking up at stars he cannot reach, and he remembers Caliban. Not the fortress world of his youth, but the burning wreck it became, and he wonders if Luther, wherever he is now, understands that they were both wrong and both right, and that the tragedy was not in their choices, but in the fact that they had to make them at all. He wonders if the Emperor, bound to his throne and unable to speak, sees the same truth, and if that knowledge brings him any comfort in his endless suffering. He wonders if the warriors who died believing they were serving the Imperium's highest ideals would forgive him if they knew the full truth, or if they would damn him as thoroughly as he has damned himself. These are questions without answers, because the dead do not speak, and the Emperor's will is unknowable, and so the lion simply stands and watches and waits, a monument to the price of secrets and the wages of loyalty, and in his silence he tells a story that no one wants to hear, but everyone needs to understand. The revelation of the Dark Angel's secret did not save the Imperium. It did not reform the Inquisition, or heal the divisions between chapters, or make the High Lords wiser. It simply added one more tragedy to a galaxy already drowning in them, and the Imperium, being what it is, absorbed that tragedy and moved on, because that is what empires do. They consume, they forget, and they endure, and the individuals caught in their machinery are ground to dust and forgotten, their stories reduced to footnotes, and their sacrifices transformed into propaganda. The Dark Angels became such a footnote, and perhaps that is the cruelest fate of all. Not to be destroyed, but to be forgotten, to have your suffering and your loyalty and your terrible choices erased by the same forces you died to protect. But memory persists in unexpected places, and the story of the First Legion, the chapter that fell not because they were weak, but because they were too loyal to ever question their own righteousness, will be told as long as there are those who understand that the greatest crimes are often committed in the name of the highest virtues. In the darkness between stars, where the Imperium's light does not reach, and its laws hold no sway, former members of the Unforgiven gather in secret, not to plan rebellion or seek vengeance, but simply to remember. They tell stories of brothers long dead, of victories won and prices paid, and they ask each other the question that haunted Azrael in his final moments: was it worth it? The answers vary, because loyalty is not a simple thing, and truth is not singular, but the question endures because it must. To forget it would be to betray not just the Dark Angels, but every warrior who has ever served the Imperium in good faith and discovered too late that faith is not enough, that loyalty can be corrupted, and that the secrets we keep to protect others often destroy us from within. This is the lesson of Caliban, and it is written in a language that only the broken can truly read. The galaxy turns, armies march, heroes rise and fall, and somewhere in the Imperium's endless archives, buried beneath layers of redaction and classification, the full story of the Dark Angel's secret still exists, waiting for the next person brave enough or foolish enough to seek it out. That person will learn what Mephirin learned, what the Lion learned, what every member of the Inner Circle eventually learned, that some truths are too heavy to carry, and that the only way to survive them is to share the burden, no matter how terrible the consequences might be. Whether the Imperium will ever learn that lesson collectively is doubtful, but individuals can, and do, and in their learning, they become something the Imperium desperately needs and does not deserve. People who value truth over comfort, who choose honesty over loyalty when the two come into conflict, and who understand that the greatest act of service is not to obey without question, but to question without fear, and to speak truth without regard for the cost. The Dark Angels are gone. Their secret is known. The war is over. But the story continues, because stories always do, and in a galaxy where hope is a currency more valuable than gold, and truth is rarer than archaeotech, the story of a chapter that died for its secrets and a Primarch who lived to regret his choices is a story worth telling, worth remembering, and worth understanding. Not because it offers easy answers or comfortable conclusions, but because it reminds us that even in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and no forgiveness, the choices we make still matter, the truths we tell still have power, and the secrets we keep still exact their price, paid in blood and measured in millennia. And in the silence that follows revelation, when all the words have been spoken and all the judgments passed, what remains is not victory or defeat, but simply the weight of knowledge, heavy as stone, immutable as fate, and as enduring as the Imperium itself.